cold heart of Nazi-occupied Norway, a silent race for the atom had begun. Few in Britain yet realized it, but a remote industrial plant perched on a mountainside could decide the future of the world. It was called Vemork, a hydroelectric station near the town of Rjukan, and behind its tall concrete walls, German scientists were producing something that no Allied bomb could easily stop: heavy water. Heavy water, or deuterium oxide, was the mysterious ingredient that physicists believed might unlock a nuclear chain reaction. In 1942, that was still theory. But, in the hands of Nazi Germany, even a theory was a threat. British intelligence officers, poring over scattered reports from Norway's resistance, began to piece together a chilling truth: Hitler's scientists were quietly advancing toward a bomb. The warnings first came from Norwegian engineers who had worked at Vemork before the German occupation in 1940. They noticed unusual demands for heavy water barrels being shipped under tight security to research centers in Germany. The Allies didn't yet have an atomic program of their own, but men like Winston Churchill and his scientific advisor, Lord Charwell, understood what that could mean. The Germans must not get it first. One memo from the War Office read in stark black ink: "If they do, we lose everything." The British knew little about the plant's layout, only that it sat high above a deep ravine, guarded by soldiers and accessible by a single suspension bridge. A direct bombing raid was nearly impossible. The mountains and weather made air strikes unpredictable, and collateral damage could wipe out hundreds of Norwegian civilians. The challenge was immense. How could one reach a fortress in the snow, strike at the heart of Nazi science, and leave no trace? Back in London, inside the dim offices of the Special Operations Executive, known as the SOE, maps were spread across a wooden table. The agency's motto, "Set Europe Ablaze," hung on the wall like a promise. The men gathered there that evening in early 1942 were not regular soldiers. They were engineers, scientists, and planners. Among them sat Major John Skinner Wilson, head of SOE operations in Scandinavia, and a handful of Norwegians who had escaped to Britain after their homeland fell. They knew the terrain. They knew the risks. As snow fell outside the windows of Baker Street headquarters, the men made a decision that would set in motion one of the most daring missions of the war: the first direct assault on the heavy water plant. The plan would be called Operation Freshman. It was simple in theory. 2 Halifax bombers would tow gliders carrying specially trained Royal Engineer Commandos. They would land on a frozen plateau above Vemork, link up with Norwegian agents already in country, and destroy the facility using timed explosives. But what looked tidy on paper was fraught with peril in practice. Norway's mountains were unforgiving, and the gliders, still new to wartime use, were notoriously difficult to handle, especially in high winds and darkness. Churchill approved the plan, but he did so with a grim expression. "This is no ordinary mission," he told his staff. "It must succeed, or it must vanish without trace." As training began at RAF Skit 10 in northern Scotland, the men of the 1st Airborne Division were briefed in secrecy. Many were volunteers, unaware of the exact nature of their target, only that it was vital to the war's outcome. Sergeant John Fairclough, one of the glider pilots, later wrote in his diary, "We're told this mission could shorten the war, or end us all. Either way, it's worth it." The engineers packed specialized explosives, plastic charges, time pencils, and detonation cords, all designed to fit neatly into their rucksacks. They learned how to move silently through snow, how to navigate by stars, how to survive in Arctic cold with limited supplies. Every hour of training drove home the same truth: the margin for error was zero. Meanwhile, back in Norway, resistance cells relayed coded messages through secret radios hidden in barns and basements. They described troop movements, weather conditions, and the brutal patrols guarding the mountains around Rjukan. "We will help them when they come," one operator wrote, "but if they fail, none of us will live to tell the story." In mid-November 1942, the signal came. The operation was a go. The men gathered on the runway in the biting Scottish wind, faces darkened with camouflage. The Halifax engines roared, the tow cables strained, and soon the gliders lifted into the storm-filled night sky. They were heading into the unknown. The air over Norway was merciless. Thick clouds, sleet, and near-zero visibility forced the aircraft off course. Icy winds tore at the gliders' wings. One by one, navigation systems failed, and pilots lost contact with their toes. Somewhere over Telemark, a glider broke apart midair, its wreckage scattering across the frozen peaks. Another crashed hard into a mountainside. Survivors who crawled from the wreck were quickly captured. The Gestapo, enforcing Hitler's Kommandobefehl, the commando order, executed them without trial. In London, radio silence stretched for days. Then, a single encoded message reached SOE headquarters. Freshmen failed. No survivors. The weight of the loss was devastating. 41 men gone, killed or executed. The heavy water plant still intact. Yet, within that failure lay a grim wisdom. The enemy knew they were being watched. They would strengthen their defenses, but so would the Allies strengthen their resolve. An SOE report later concluded, the lesson of freshmen is not caution, but persistence. As Churchill read the after-action summary, he underlined one sentence in pencil: the plant remains our greatest danger. Then, in the margin, he wrote two words that would define the next phase of the mission: try again. What no one knew then was that a small band of Norwegians, men who had been waiting in the wilderness during the failed landing, were still alive. Hungry, frostbitten, but unbroken, they had vanished into the mountains, determined to finish what others had begun. And in the shadow of Norway's frozen cliffs, the secret war for the atom was only just beginning. By the winter of 1942, the echoes of Operation Freshman still haunted the corridors of Britain's Special Operations Executive. 41 brave men had perished in the icy wilds of Norway, some in the crash, others executed under Hitler's brutal commando order. Yet, even as their families mourned, Churchill's war cabinet was already demanding a second attempt. The Germans still controlled the Vemork plant, and its production of heavy water, the lifeblood of their nuclear experiments, continued unabated. The challenge was staggering. After the Freshman disaster, Germany had reinforced the facility with extra guards, floodlights, and minefields. The Gestapo scoured the mountains for resistance members, while winter storms turned the terrain into a frozen wasteland. Still, the British could not afford to abandon the mission. We cannot allow Hitler to possess what we have not yet begun, one senior scientist from the Tube Alloys Project, the British atomic program, warned MI6. The race for the atom had begun, and it was one the Allies could not lose. Inside a secluded manor house in Scotland, a new team began training for what would become Operation Gunnerside. Unlike the ill-fated glider troops of freshmen, this unit would rely on stealth, endurance, and local expertise. They were all Norwegians, men who had fled their occupied homeland, now returning to strike against their oppressors. Their leader was a 23-year-old lieutenant named Joachim Ronneberg, soft-spoken but fiercely determined. Under the SOE's guidance, Ronneberg's squad trained in demolitions, silent movement, and winter survival. They learned to march across mountains in blizzards, to navigate by the North Star, and to operate in total isolation. An instructor at the camp later recalled, "They never complained. They were not driven by orders, but by vengeance." The men had names that would later become legend: Knut Haukelid, Frederick Kaiser, Caspar Eidland, Hans Storhog, Birger Stromsheim. Each of them had lost friends or family under Nazi rule. For them, this mission was personal. The SOE's new plan was simple in design but almost impossible in execution. The team would parachute into Norway, link up with a small group of local resistance fighters, known as the Grouse Team, who had been stranded in the mountains since the freshman mission, and together they would infiltrate the Vemork facility on foot. No gliders, no heavy equipment, only skis, explosives, and courage. In February 1943, under a moonless sky, a Halifax bomber lifted off from Scotland carrying Ronneberg's team. The flight was silent except for the hum of the engines and the occasional crackle of the radio. When the jump signal came, the men exchanged brief nods, no words. One by one, they plunged into the darkness, parachutes opening like white blossoms against the night sky. They landed in waist-deep snow on the Hardangervidda Plateau, more than 3,000 feet above sea level. Below them stretched miles of untouched wilderness, the temperature dropping to -20. Finding the Grouse Team was their first challenge. The Norwegians had been living for months in isolation, surviving on moss, frozen reindeer meat, and sheer willpower. When the two groups finally reunited, the scene was almost biblical. 6 frostbitten men emerging from the snow to meet 4 gaunt figures wrapped in animal skins. They embraced in silence, aware that every word could carry across the wind to German patrols. The combined team now faced a new problem: how to reach Vemork undetected. The plant sat on a cliff, with a 200-foot-deep ravine separating it from the mountainside. Only one bridge crossed the abyss, heavily guarded and illuminated by searchlights. The Germans assumed no one would be mad enough to attempt an approach from below. That assumption would prove fatal. For days, the team scouted the terrain, studying the river, the ice, the patterns of the guards' movements. Ronneberg's notes from the time read, "The ravine is suicide. Therefore, it is the only way." Each night, they inched closer to their target, sleeping in snow caves and moving only when the wind masked their sounds. Supplies were scarce. Radios failed in the cold. Their food was running out. "We live on dreams and coffee grounds," Hockelid wrote to London in a coded transmission. Still, morale held. Each man carried the weight of a country on his back, and none intended to fail. As they prepared for the assault, the men discussed what might happen if they were captured. They all knew about the fate of the freshman commandos. Ronneberg told them quietly, "If anyone must stay behind, it will be me." There was no bravado in his tone, only resolve. A week before the planned attack, they received a brief radio message from London: "Proceed as planned. Godspeed." No further instructions. No promises of rescue. The night of February 27, 1943, arrived with biting cold and silence so deep it seemed to swallow sound. The men checked their weapons, a few Sten guns, pistols, and a single set of explosives wrapped in wool to muffle the noise. They skied for hours through the darkness until the massive concrete structure of Vemork rose before them, glowing faintly under the moonlight. The plan was as audacious as it was desperate. Cross the frozen river, climb the ravine wall, and enter the plant through a cable tunnel the Germans believed impassable. If they were caught, there would be no retreat. Before setting off, Ronneberg looked back at his men. "Remember," he whispered, "the world will never know our names if we fail, but it will never forget what happens if we succeed." Then, with nothing but the sound of wind and snow beneath their boots, the saboteurs began their descent into the abyss, their figures swallowed by the dark. The operation that would soon become legend was about to begin. On the night of February 27, 1943, 6 lightly armed Norwegians slipped beneath the nose of Nazi Germany's security and into the belly of Europe's most dangerous industrial secret. The men belonged to Compagnie Ling, the Norwegian independent company trained by Britain's Special Operations Executive. Led by Lieutenant Joachim Ronneberg and including veterans like Knut Hockelid and Birger Stromsheim, they had waited for weeks on the Hardangervidda plateau, living in snow holes, rationing what little food they carried, and listening for the rhythm of German patrols. Their target was the Vemork hydroelectric plant at Rjukan, perched above the Tinsjo Gorge and ringed with barbed wire, searchlights, and Wehrmacht sentries. A frontal assault was impossible. Heavy water production cells and electrolyzers lay deep within a reinforced concrete works. The Norwegians carried only what they could ski with: a few Sten submachine guns, pistols, knives, ropes, climbing crampons, and timed demolition charges supplied by SOE, plastic explosives and detonators rigged with time pencils. Survival depended on silence, accuracy, and brutal physical endurance in temperatures that dipped well below freezing. Tactically, the odds were stacked against them. The Germans believed the ravine a natural barrier and had concentrated guard patrols on the obvious approaches. The saboteurs' plan hinged on a long, dangerous approach from below. They would descend to the factory's cable gallery, a narrow service tunnel that hugged the cliff face, cut through the heavy ventilation and enter the production area from a place the enemy assumed impossible to reach. Moving in 2 small teams to reduce detection, they skied by night, crawled across ice, and climbed with pitons and hemp ropes. At one point, with the plant's lights throwing long shadows, Ronneberg's party lay within earshot of sentries and did not move for hours, every man's breath catching in the chill air. Exhaustion and the threat of discovery were constant companions. Once inside, the commandos worked with the calm of technicians and the urgency of men who know history is watching. They located the electrolysis room, the heart of heavy water production, and placed charges on the cells and on pipework feeding the condensers. Ronneberg later reflected in his memoirs that the team trained as if every moment demanded a lifetime's courage. A contemporary SOE report noted the precision of the attack. The saboteurs targeted machinery rather than killing workers, aiming to stop production while minimizing civilian casualties, a strategic choice reflecting both military judgment and moral restraint. In less than an hour, the charges detonated. Alarms shrieked, windows shattered, and the plant's electrolyzers were ruined. The operation destroyed a significant portion of the plant's capacity and set back the German heavy water program by months. For modern viewers, the raid is a study in asymmetric warfare, how a small, disciplined unit, using intelligence, local know-how, and surgical sabotage, can neutralize a much larger industrial threat without wholesale destruction. The mission underscored the value of local partners, precise intelligence, and proportionality in action. Compagnie Ling's success sprang from combining British technical support with Norwegians' intimate knowledge of terrain and language, a template that remains relevant to special operations planning today. The team melted away into the mountains under the cover of darkness and a wide-out snowstorm, leaving Vemork in ruins but the wider threat unresolved. For a few days, confusion reigned in Rjukan as the Germans interrogated prisoners and scoured the countryside. Some of the saboteurs slipped back to safe houses, others made a perilous trek to neutral Sweden, and the radio lines to London filled with terse, ecstatic messages. Gunner side succeeded. Heavy water plant rendered inoperative. But victory came with uneasy questions. Intelligence later revealed that not all the heavy water had been destroyed. Barrels remained, and German engineers were already planning to replace the damaged equipment or evacuate what remained. The Allies had won a brilliant tactical success, yet the strategic picture remained clouded. Was the delay long enough? Had every possible stock of heavy water been accounted for? As dawn broke over the frozen ravine, the saboteurs looked back at the smoking silhouette of Vemork and carried into the wind an uncertain triumph, one that would force the next, even riskier decisions in the quiet war for the atom. The sabotage at Vemork on February 27, 1943, was over in less than half an hour, but its consequences would echo for decades. What began as a pinpoint strike by a handful of Norwegians became one of the most dramatic escapes in modern warfare. As the final echoes of the explosion rolled across the Rjukan Valley, the saboteurs faced the second half of their mission, getting out alive. The plant's garrison of more than 3,000 German soldiers was now on full alert, scouring the mountains for intruders. Floodlights probed the snowfields. Dogs and ski troops fanned out along the tracks leading north and east. In the electrolysis chamber, broken pipes hissed, steam fogging the air. German engineers stumbled through the wreckage, bewildered at how anyone could have reached the most heavily guarded industrial site in Norway. The saboteurs, meanwhile, were already gone, sliding silently down the ravine and vanishing into the storm. For the next several days, Joachim Ronneberg's team survived on the edge of exhaustion. They traveled by night, resting only long enough to thaw frozen fingers around the brief warmth of a candle flame. One misstep meant capture and execution. German aircraft circled overhead, dropping flares over the mountain plateaus. Patrols left food rations as bait, hoping to draw the fugitives out. But the Norwegians knew the terrain better. They hid in abandoned shepherd huts, camouflaged their tracks with spruce branches, and relied on sympathetic farmers who risked their lives to offer bread and coffee. "We were ghosts," Ronneberg later wrote, "moving in daylight only when the snow fell thick enough to hide our shadows." In London, Churchill's War Cabinet received the first decrypted reports from Norway with disbelief. The raid had succeeded, the heavy water plant was crippled, and not a single saboteur had been killed or captured. Churchill scribbled in the margin of the intelligence summary, "Well done. The enemy must learn that nowhere is safe." Yet the Prime Minister also understood the fragile line between triumph and tragedy. The Gunnerside team had done what the entire RAF could not. They had shut down the heavy water operation without bombing civilians. Their precision embodied a new kind of warfare, one rooted not in mass destruction but in skill and nerve. For modern audiences, the escape from Vemork stands as a textbook example of guerrilla survival. The men split into smaller groups to confuse pursuit. Ronneberg and 5 of his companions set off on a 250-mile journey across the mountains toward neutral Sweden, dragging their skis and weapons through endless snowdrifts. Others, like Knut Haukelid, stayed behind in Norway to organize new resistance cells. At one point during the escape, temperatures fell to -30°C, ice formed in their eyebrows and boots, and they rationed frozen reindeer meat to the ounce. Yet their radio operator in London later said that every transmission he received came with the sound of laughter between the lines. Back at Vemork, the Germans began an exhaustive investigation. SS officers interrogated plant workers, suspecting inside help. They even arrested and tortured locals, demanding to know who had guided the saboteurs. But no one broke. The resistance network had been built on silence. German technicians worked frantically to repair the damage. Within months, small-scale production of heavy water resumed. Hitler, furious at the setback, ordered the material transported to Germany under armed guard once the plant was fully operational again. The reprieve the Allies had won was temporary. The story of the Gunnerside escape offers a lesson in resilience, how determination, preparation, and trust among comrades can overcome the most hostile conditions. In every modern commando training program, from the British SAS to the US Army Rangers, instructors still cite the Telemark saboteurs as models of endurance and discipline. Their mission became a study in how to blend stealth, patience, and technical precision to achieve strategic results without large-scale engagement. By mid-March 1943, Ronneberg's party crossed the Swedish border. Emaciated but unbroken, they were greeted by Allied officers who could hardly believe that every man had survived. "Mission accomplished," Ronneberg reported simply. Yet even as they warmed themselves by a Swedish fire, word reached them that the Germans had repaired part of the plant and resumed shipments. The relief of survival gave way to a familiar unease. The heavy water that remained could still fuel Hitler's nuclear hopes, and the Allied command knew they had bought only time, not victory. In the snows of Telemark, the wrecked factory smoked under a gray sky, a symbol of both defiance and unfinished business. Somewhere beneath the ice, barrels of heavy water waited, and soon, so would the men who had sworn to stop them once and for all. The raid on Vemork had crippled the Germans' heavy water production, but it had not ended it. By 1944, Hitler's scientists were still determined to salvage what they could of their atomic ambitions. And so began a final, desperate chapter, a battle not fought with guns or bombs, but with barrels and a ferry. In the months following the Gunnerside raid, the Germans painstakingly repaired the damaged sections of the Vemork plant. Production resumed at a reduced rate, under even tighter security. Every drop of heavy water, precious deuterium oxide, was guarded as if it were gold. To the Allies, it was more dangerous than gold. It was the key ingredient for a potential nuclear chain reaction. Intelligence from the Norwegian resistance and intercepted communications revealed that the Germans were planning to move the remaining heavy water to Germany for safekeeping. The material would be transported down the steep Rjukan Valley by rail, then across Lake Tinsjo aboard the ferry SF Hydro, before continuing by train to Oslo and onward to the Reich. When that message reached London in early 1944, it caused alarm at the highest levels. Churchill's staff understood that if the barrels reached Germany, the nuclear program might continue unabated. The British knew they could not risk a conventional attack on the ferry. Civilian passengers used it daily, and a bombing run would mean heavy casualties. Instead, the SOE turned again to their man inside Norway, Knut Haukelid, one of the surviving Gunnerside saboteurs who had chosen to remain behind after the raid. Haukelid was the perfect choice, resourceful, quiet, and utterly fearless. By 1944, he had become a legend among the Norwegian underground. His task was simple to define but nearly impossible to execute: sink the ferry carrying the barrels of heavy water, without allowing the Germans to recover them or suspect sabotage. "We must make it look like an accident," his SOE contact in London instructed, "but it must be final." Haukelid and a small team infiltrated Rjukan under the cover of darkness. They studied the ferry's schedule, its crew, and the location of the barrels in the cargo hold. After weeks of observation, they learned that the barrels would be loaded aboard the SF Hydro on the night of February 19, 1944. The saboteurs smuggled aboard a small explosive charge fitted with a time fuse. enough to rupture the hull and sink the ship, but not so much as to cause a catastrophic explosion. Hochulid's journal entry for that night reads, "We have done what we must. God forgive us if we are wrong." At 10:45 a.m., as the ferry steamed across the icy waters of Lake Tinzhou, the charges detonated. The explosion tore a hole in the hull, and within minutes the ship began to list. Passengers scrambled for lifeboats as freezing water poured in. Of the 47 people aboard, 29 perished, including several German soldiers, but the barrels of heavy water sank to the bottom, unrecoverable. The remaining passengers were pulled from the freezing water by locals who had rushed to the shore. The ferry vanished beneath the surface, taking with it the last significant stockpile of heavy water in Nazi hands. The sinking of the SF Hydro remains one of the most precise acts of wartime sabotage ever recorded, a mission that combined moral conflict with strategic necessity. The loss of civilian life weighed heavily on Hochulid and his comrades, but the alternative, a German nuclear weapon, was unthinkable. In modern terms, the operation exemplified the grim calculus of wartime ethics. How far a free world must go to prevent a greater evil? After the ferry's sinking, German efforts to rebuild their heavy water production never fully recovered. By the summer of 1944, Allied advances in France and Italy had begun to close in on the Reich, and Hitler's nuclear project was effectively paralyzed. In hindsight, historians have called Hochulid's action the moment when the Nazi atomic dream truly died. "One ship went down," wrote a British intelligence analyst after the war, "and with it, an empire's hope for the bomb." Today, the wreck of the SF Hydro still lies on the bottom of Lake Tinzhou, its barrels intact and preserved in the cold depths. Divers who have visited the site describe an eerie stillness, a ghostly cargo from a world on the brink. For decades, local Norwegians spoke of the ferry with quiet reverence, knowing that its sacrifice had changed history. Yet for Knut Hochulid, the memory never left him. Years later, when asked if he regretted the loss of life, he simply replied, "I regret every life lost. But I do not regret the act. We stopped something far worse." The operation was over. The war, however, was not. And in London's intelligence rooms, new questions began to stir. Had the Germans truly abandoned their nuclear ambitions? Or had the real secrets already been moved elsewhere, beyond Allied reach? When the Second World War finally ended in 1945, the ruins of the Vemork plant stood silent above the Rjukan Valley. The machinery was cold, the pipes twisted, and the heavy water barrels long gone. Yet for years afterward, mystery still surrounded the question that haunted Allied scientists. Just how close had Hitler come to building the bomb? In the months following Germany's surrender, British and American intelligence launched Operation Alsos, a covert mission to locate and assess the Reich's nuclear program. Teams of physicists and intelligence officers swept through bombed-out laboratories in Germany, France, and Austria, collecting documents and interrogating scientists. Among the names they sought were Werner Heisenberg, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, and Kurt Diebner, the architects of Germany's atomic dream. When the Allies finally reached them, they found laboratories underfunded, experiments half-finished, and a shortage of the one ingredient that could have changed everything: heavy water. The barrels that might have powered their reactors now rested at the bottom of a Norwegian lake. For the men of the SOE and the Norwegian resistance, that knowledge was bittersweet. They had risked everything to stop a threat whose true magnitude they could only guess. Ronneberg, Hochulid, and their comrades were quietly debriefed in London, awarded medals, and sent home to rebuild their lives. There were no parades, no public announcements. The details of their missions remained classified for decades. "We did what was needed," Ronneberg said simply. That was enough. The Vemork and Tinzhou operations became case studies in wartime precision. How small, specialized teams could change the trajectory of global conflict. British intelligence officers wrote later that the Telemark missions were the most successful acts of sabotage in the entire war. The raids had delayed, disrupted, and ultimately denied Hitler a weapon that could have altered history. But beyond the military triumph lay something deeper, a story of courage rooted not in command but in conviction. The Norwegians fought for a country occupied, for a cause unseen, and for a future none of them might live to witness. When declassified documents surfaced in the 1970s, revealing the full scope of Germany's nuclear efforts, historians confirmed what Churchill had suspected all along. Without the destruction of the heavy water stocks, the Nazi atomic project might have reached critical mass by 1945. The operations at Vemork and Lake Tinzhou had done more than sabotage a factory. They had changed the direction of scientific history. In an age where nuclear proliferation remains a global concern, the lessons of Telemark still resonate. Vigilance, intelligence, and moral courage are the most powerful weapons of all. The story of the Norwegian saboteurs reminds us that victory in war is not always achieved by armies or governments, but sometimes by a handful of individuals who refuse to surrender to inevitability. Their mission showed that even in the darkest winters of occupation, human resolve could alter the fate of nations. Modern special forces and intelligence agencies still study their tactics, not merely for their precision, but for their restraint and their sense of purpose. Today, the Vemork plant has been transformed into the Norwegian Industrial Workers' Museum. Visitors walk the same halls where German scientists once labored, and where Ronneberg's team planted their explosives in silence. The rusted pipes and scorched walls remain as testimony to the courage that turned back the tide of nuclear tyranny. Deep in Lake Tinzhou, the wreck of the SF Hydro rests untouched, a tomb for history's might-have-beens. As wind sweeps through the Telemark Mountains, the ghosts of that winter still whisper their warning, that the smallest act, made in secret, can change the course of the world. The men of Vemork disappeared quietly back into civilian life, their war ended. But their legacy endures, not as soldiers, nor as saboteurs, but as guardians of a world that might never have existed without them.